Hello and welcome back to A Better World. This is your host, Mitchell J. Rabin, and I'm very glad you're joining us again today. Today we're going to have another very interesting show as we have invited on a wonderful writer, thinker, teacher, Glenn Aparicio Parry, who is the author of Original Thinking, a radical revisioning of time, humanity, and nature. Those of you who listen to A Better World with any regularity know that we look to discuss these types of subjects and the nature of thinking and our interpretation of reality, the way our belief systems are influencing our thinking all of the time, and what we can do to revision, to expand, and take more of each other, our brothers and sisters, basically, into consideration and beyond all sentient life and even the larger cosmology in which we actually find ourselves when we look north and look up. So a word about our guest today, Glenn Parry. Glenn is a writer, educational consultant, international speaker, entrepreneur, and visionary whose lifelong passion has been to help reform thinking and education into a coherent and cohesive whole. He is the founder and past president of the Seed Institute. Glenn is currently the president of the think tank, the Circle for Original Thinking. He earned his BA in psychology from Allegheny College and then went on to earn both his master's in psychology and PhD in humanities with a concentration in transformative learning from the California Institute of Integral Studies. Glenn organized and participated in the groundbreaking Language of Spirit conferences from 1999 through to 2011 that brought together Native and Western scientists in dialogue, moderated by Leroy Littlebear. He has also appeared in a few different documentaries, including Journey to Turtle Island. So it's with great pleasure and honor to have Glenn on with me today. I also want to just thank James O.D., who has been on these airwaves several times, for recommending that I have Glenn on the show to talk about his original work in original thinking. So thank you, James. And Glenn, thanks for being on the show with me today. I love the thought of being able to spend some time unpacking this beautiful work that you've been doing.
Oh, thank
Welcome.
you very much, Mitchell.
Sure.
It's a blessing, great blessing to be on
the
show.
Good.
Oh, and just as I said that, a Cooper hawk appeared in front of me outside the window.
Oh,
wow.
This looks like an omen in your Santa
Yeah, it's a good
Fe,
omen.
correct?
It's always good. Always good.
Always good. That's wonderful. Well, thank you for sharing that, Glenn. It's interesting that as we, in the world that we inhabit, of original and indigenous and creative thinking, there are no mistakes. Everything happens in its own way and its own reason. So, with that said,
yes.
I welcome such omens. Would you please start with laying out the premise of your thinking here in this wonderful book that I've really been enjoying, Original Thinking?
Oh, well, thank you very much. Well, one of the first things I wanted to revision was time. So we're going to go back to that omen in a minute because, the concept of linear time has this idea that an event happens and it's irreversible, and then you move from one event to another event on this kind of line.
Yes.
A different way of thinking about things, which was introduced to me by Tobasanakut Kanu and others, but what Tobasanakut himself said was just this question. He asked, what kinds of things want to happen together? So that goes to the omens. Certain things, if you start looking for what kinds of things want to happen together, then everything that does happen becomes more meaningful. And it's a very, very different way of looking at the world. All of this came about because of a question that Leroy Littlebear asked in a dialogue circle in 1999 that I had convened between these Native American elders and Western scientists. He just asked the simple question, is it possible to come up with an original thought? And that's when the Western people in the room, with the exception of one or two, tried to think of something brand new that never been done before or said before. So in other words, they're thinking of time as a line, and original is something new that's never happened before.
Novel.
Yeah, novel, exactly. And the indigenous people took the question completely differently, going to the heart of the word, going to origin as place, and they look for original instructions for how to live on the planet, and they saw origin as a place of regeneration, a place of healing. Very, very different approaches,
entirely.
And really a lot of the work.
Interesting.
Yeah, I mean, I just want to say one more thing. Just a lot of the work unfolds from there, so we're looking at how the Western world came to see time as a line.
Exactly.
And that's what I try to...
So there's a past, there's a present, and there's a future along some kind of linear time that we can keep track of, and we have this thing called history, which, of course, when we break that down, we get his story, and we know how his story is so not only subjective but biased, and oftentimes the victors are those who actually write the story.
Well, you're a very a beautiful thinker. I love what you're doing, and I want to politely say to you that actually history doesn't come from his story. So it comes from his story. It comes from historia, which is a Greek word, meaning an in-depth examination of a particular. The word is still used in its original meaning for, let's say, a therapist wants to take a history of the person. It's not a history as like what happened on this date or not. It really doesn't come from his story, although it's a good assumption to make since we live in the patriarchal time.
Well, yeah, exactly. I mean, you can't say that even though that might not be the etymology, obviously, it's not Greek as such, but it still has its own, at least superficial meaning as such. But what you're saying is historia is its root, and that meaning is more like a personal biography. Is that where?
Yeah, an in-depth examination, an immersion into the story, actually into the story, and that's a very, very different way of thinking than when we're trying to. Again, it's almost like we've accepted this idea that history is about events. That's how we learned it in school. It was on this timeline.
Yeah.
And the timeline wasn't even invented till 250 years ago. We never even needed it before, because we just went into deep stories about it. So isn't that interesting?
Yes, it is. Yes, it is. No question about it. I can't help but also just comment, maybe playfully, Glenn, that the word historia then in Greek is not that far away from the word hysteria. And I don't know if there's any other relationship. You can't help but
very interesting, which is very feminine,
exactly.
Yes, of
from
course.
Which we get hysterectomy, of course, right?
We get hysterectomy. Exactly. Yes, we do. Yes.
And
I love the origin of words because it uncovers the archaeology of the mind. So please forgive me for saying that.
For nothing. There's nothing to forgive. I so appreciate. I mean, this is how I learn, my friend. So God knows. Thank you. Truly. So unpacking that story, if you will, about linear time, and so when we get into original thinking, i.e., let's say we use the word indigenous, so that is, again, rooted to place. And from that point of view, everyone is indigenous because everyone comes from a certain area or region of land that is sort of their stake in it. when we use the word indigenous these days, we're usually referring to people who have a longer standing relationship to the land of their birth and those of their prior generations and ancestors. So bring that to bear on this conversation, if you would.
Well, there's another interesting word, indigenous. You know, the actual root of that word is from the Greek indina, and it's really related to the guts or entrails of the earth. I mean, it's a very so if you're indigenous, you are so connected to the earth that to tear yourself away from it is going to really rip your guts out. So it's kind of that.
God.
That's the feeling.
Yes, I hear you.
You know, that's the feeling of it. But, of course, the word has so many other definitions, political definitions from the United Nations about...
Yes, legalistic. Yeah.
Legalistic, and a person can say, hey, you know, I'm a native New Yorker or something, or I'm a, you know, I mean, and that has validity. Right. But, so I would say this. I would just say, try to verb it. You know, it's really about indigenizing. You know, it's about remembering how to connect with the land. That allows everybody to do it.
Yes, exactly. Well, one of the things I found so interesting is this point that you bring up. First of all, we know that there are languages, especially, how do I put it, Native American languages, that are more process and verb-oriented, since you mentioned that, Glenn, unlike a more nominally based linguistics like English, where things are particleized and we're looking more at nouns. And that actually extends to the idea of looking at time as a series of events, as opposed to, distinct from, a process that is ongoing, like you were saying, going deep into story, where time actually feels like it ceases to exist. Very interesting. So there's this relationship between the way we tell stories and the way we engage stories, the language we're using to tell the story, and our relationship to time.
Yeah, I think that's very, very true. So that's going back to where we started, the story of the stories, the getting immersion, the way we see the world is not as obvious as it appears to be. I mean, one thing that I like to talk about is dreams, because I think the way we see the world in our dreams is a vestige or a remembering, or perhaps just a rebalancing of the odd way we're seeing the world in our waking life. Because we you know, the quick story, I mean, you know, that I like to go to that happened exactly 600 years ago is and I go into it in the book, is what happened when we invented linear perspective in art, you know, because it was just this cat. I didn't say this in the book, but, you know, it was just Brunelleschi, or Brunelleschi, I'm not sure how to pronounce it, frankly. In 1415, exactly 600 years ago, he pokes a hole in the painting, he puts a mirror behind it, and he created a 3D illusion on a 2D canvas. And it wouldn't have changed the world, except this other cat, Alberti, comes by 20 years later. He systematizes it. He puts it in a book. He shows people how to do perspective, you know, creating the vanishing point and whatnot. And it became viral as much as anything could in that time. You know, it was translated in 6-7 languages and spread through Europe. And then it became realism. It became known as realism, the real way we see the world. But is it real, Mitchell? I don't think so.
Right. It's a very good question, Glenn.
What George O'Keeffe said is the least real thing is realism. You know, and I agree with her because we have two moving and watery eyes. And what linear perspective does, it gives you a view from one stationary eye out in lines, and it created this emphasis on separation between humans and nature. That's what we're always talking about today. But the root cause of it, or at least the most immediate root cause of it, is this creation of perspective and the idea that was more real than being immersed in the world. So you see what I'm saying? When we're dreaming, we're immersed in the world, and I don't think that's less real. That's, everything in a dream image is alive. Everything is numinous. Everything is vibrating. And for some people, that's the way they see it when they're awake.
Yeah, exactly. That's right. It's you're hovering in this very interesting space relating to consciousness here, Glenn, which is what's real and how do we know it? What are our tests for reality, if you will? And is the dreaming state less real than that world of sensory awareness that we identify as real? So it begs the question, could we engage our imagination and really be as real? And it's so funny because if you really inquire into dreams, we see that it was dreams that gave rise to those things that we call most real, like the structure of the atom, right?
Yeah.
Niels Bohr. And we see that there's this interdimensional state where people dream up a future. Let's just put ourselves on the linear timeline again for a moment, like a merry-go-round. Well, wait a minute, that's not exact, but you know what I mean. And we could see that when we go into this more of a quasi-dimensional state of alpha or a theta state, which is more of a contemplative and meditative state, we can start to get clearer about the things that are important to us and start to envision a kind of life, a kind of being that we really want to manifest. And neuroscience seems to show us that our dream state actually starts to materialize after all. So how do you go figure that one out?
Well, you brought up a lot of things there.
Go for it. Go for it.
Here's the way I tend to think of things. Our consciousness is really formed from nature. Our thoughts are like water. So, and this is why we use these metaphors. I don't know, for some reason I'm heavy into the weeds of language. But that's important,
I love it, absolutely.
That's why we talk about mainstream consciousness, the stream of consciousness, mainstream thought, underground thought itself looks like a cloud. And when it's not just a fictional depiction. If clairvoyants say thought is like a cloud, stale thought evaporates. It kind of hobnobs with other clouds, and then we get a brainstorm. The whole thing. There's a reason why Native Americans traditionally knew how to control the weather, because their consciousness was interconnected with the weather, and they knew that. That's the same reason why indigenous peoples, when there was a tsunami approaching in Indonesia, went to the ocean's edge and spoke to the storm. It can be done. So here's the thing. I think everybody is receiving their consciousness from nature. It's just that we have different filters. One of the filters is language, like you brought up before. The Western language, and it goes back to linear perspective and stuff, isolates things. And so we have an abundance of nouns. Indigenous language doesn't do that. It's more immersive. It's not about linear perspective. When you see art by indigenous people, they don't generally use perspective, even though they can. And sometimes they use both. An immersive consciousness is more verby. It's moving, and that's closer to reality, I would say, because that is the way it is. And so, the reason why those dialogues ever started, the reason why Leroy Little Bear approached David Bohm, these dialogues that I later inherited and convened didn't begin with me. They began with Leroy approaching David Bohm because he really appreciated what David Bohm, as a visionary physicist, was doing. Bohm looked inside the atom and he realized there were no longer any things. That's something Alfred North Whitehead said. But But Bohm agreed, and Bohm tried to create a language or a mode of language, which he called the Rheo mode, R-H-E-O, using the Greek word to flow. And he wanted, it basically was making English into a verby, like kind of adding ing onto everything. And he did that because he realized
like a gerundive.
Gerundive. We'll just call you you're Mitchelling, and I'll be Glenning, from now on.
Exactly.
So, it's like Bucky Fuller talks about, I am not a noun, I'm a verb. We are
verbs. I seem to be a verb. I
think it's a pretty cool way of thinking about the world. So what we're talking about here is something very real, because we now know, even in since quantum theory, that everything is moving. Everything is not what it appears to be, or like that group, the ICEM, the International Association for Study of Subtle Energies and Energy Medicine.
In Boulder.
I think they should have a motto: "Things are not as they seem to be." But never mind.
That's cute. Right. Never mind. Also true. You're reminding me of the ancient Chinese sage statement that I actually quote all the time and use in my practice and everything else, is the only constant in life is change itself. And that happens to be a reality that we actually dig our heels in, because we, on some egoic level, don't like change as much as we may talk about wanting and needing change, yet everything is constantly changing and nothing ever remains the same but ever. And it's just one of those ironies and paradoxes of life that we're always facing. So I very much appreciate what you're saying, and about the thoughts coming from nature and even having the elemental qualities of nature, and why in the world should we be surprised by that? We should be just, with some equanimity about it as just the way it is.
Well, it's so important, I think. I think the world would shift for the better immensely if we simply remembered that the elements are alive, that they create our consciousness, and we rebuild a relationship with the elements. We treat water lovingly. We treat water as our mother. We treat water as the source of all life. We treat the air in the same way. We breathe it in because, look, we couldn't be alive if the air, if what we breathed in was dead out there. How did we go to this strange place where we began to believe that the air is dead, or we used to believe in the pneuma, the ruach, the prana. We understood that. I mean, it's just we just forgot.
Exactly, and that's a good way of putting it. And so your book and your work and your ongoing dialogues, Glenn, are helping the planet,
thank you.
Its human inhabitants wake up to and remember, as in putting the pieces. I oftentimes use the phrase putting Humpty Dumpty back together again, making Humpty Dumpty whole again from being the cracked, fragmented being that he became through the the story. It's interesting.
We were talking last night briefly, and you brought up something. You've done a lot of work with Gurdjieff, and that it only occurred to me that the work that I'm speaking of is very congruent with that kind of work. It's about remembering and who we are. We already are whole. We just have forgotten.
That's right. It's really true. It's really true. And you have had this wonderful background with Little Bear, and you became imbued with Turtle Island Native American thinking. And would you share with us a little bit about this interface between quantum physics and Native American language and cosmological understanding? I mean, one of the things that people like you and I love about quantum physics is that it has scientifically corroborated what our guts and intuition have been telling us about the nature of reality all along. Everything is process. There's a wavicle more than a particle. Spaces. A thing is primarily empty. A la David Bohm. And we know this somehow deeply, and Zen tells us, and all of the ancient wisdom teachings have been reiterating this, and the Western man in his linear left hemispheric mode sort of goes, what? How could it be? But yet, their mathematics, formed, of course, down during Einstein's time, shows us that this is in fact real. And I'd love to hear from you a bit about that thinking as it is experienced by and spoken of by the native elders that you've been connected with.
That's beautiful. Okay, I would be happy to do that, but I would like to, if with your permission, maybe do it in the context of stories, because I could talk about my experience in Native America, but I think it might be more useful for your listeners to hear more of a story.
That's one of the beauties of your book, by the way. Yeah. At the beginning of your book, you engage us in stories at the beginning of your book that is very heartwarming, I'll just tell you.
Well, thank you. And that I'm not sure which one you're referring to, but you might be referring to the one about Dan Moonhawk Alford.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, I can tell that one too. That's his story. I'll tell. We got back to that somehow.
Glenn, please. We're sitting around the campfire with you. Please tell us. Before you do so, let me just let everyone know you are listening to A Better World with Mitchell J. Rabin. We're on every Wednesday at 6 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. If you do not yet get our newsletter, please go to www.abetterworld.tv. Become part of A Better World's family and community. We're spending today's show with Glenn Aparicio Parry, who is the author of Original Thinking, a radical revisioning of time, humanity, and nature, who is about to tell us some stories.
Oh, beautiful, beautiful. Thank you. Well, the first story I want to tell is an important story because my mentor into Native America was Dan Moonhawk Alford. I was blessed to take a class from him in 1983 it was called Anthropological Linguistics, but that title didn't even begin to capture it. Moonhawk liked to describe himself as standing at the lonely intersection of quantum physics, Native America, consciousness, and language. And indeed, that was a lonely intersection. Not that many people understood the confluence of those ideas, but that's what the class was about. And he told us to take a diary because he knew the class would change our life, and it did. So here's how Moonhawk liked to tell the story about how when he was 9 years old, his father invited him to come to his workplace. And his father was working as a longshoresman up in the northern California in the redwood forest near the ocean. And so they spent the morning on a jitney, and they were stacking up logs. And that was great fun for a 9-year-old, right? But then lunchtime came, and they took their lunch, dangling their legs over looking at the Pacific Ocean. And Moonhawk had never seen the ocean before. And so he says to his father, "Dad, that sure is a lot of water out there." His father looks it over and says, "Yep, and that's just the top of it." And Moonhawk liked to tell that story to illustrate his feeling of the depth of Native American wisdom and how to remind himself. And when I met Moonhawk, he already had 20, 25 years of friendships in Native America, but he wanted to remind himself about how deep that wisdom is. So then, let me tell you another story from my own experience. When I was first invited to the Canyoncito Band of Navajo, their sacred grounds, and this was shortly after I began SEED, and grandfather Leon Secretary already was one of the most beautiful persons I'd ever met. I mean, the first years I met him, I didn't even hear the words he was saying because I was sort of in a trance, and yet he was speaking from heart to heart. He communicated vibrationally, and he did that in Navajo, and he did that in English as well. So he invited me to these sacred grounds, and the reservation of the Cañoncito Band in Navajo is only 30 miles west of Albuquerque. But to get there really isn't a passable road to the north where their ancestral grounds are. So we had to go south 5 miles, then we had to go east 25 miles, and then we had to go north 35 miles, then we had to go west 50 miles, then we had to come back south across all dirt roads and unbelievably difficult dirt roads, going down into deep gullies, which we would call dimensions hills, and resurfacing somehow, if you know, and then it takes like 5 hours to get there. So just getting there was beautiful. And then when we arrived, one of the first things I saw is this area where we set up camp actually was surrounded by 8 buttes. One of them, if people know New Mexico, is Cabezon, but there's 7 other buttes which kind of unveiled themselves slowly and then just appeared as we came into this site, and that's why it's sacred. Those are the original warriors. Now, there were also young men who were acting as warriors overlooking the camp. But anyway, that first day we said prayers, we sung songs, and we told stories late into the night, and we tended the ceremonial fire. Now, I really didn't understand the concept, but for some reason, people asked me in my very first year to tend the ceremonial fire, and that was when I learned how to do that. That's when I learned that. It was very different than what my father taught me. My father was a beautiful man, and his mother's Basque. He has some very ancient wisdom knowledge, but he was also an engineer, and he taught me about, you position the wood this way, and I tended to think of it kind of technically like that at that time.
Yeah.
But then I learned, you have to build a relationship with the fire. The fire is living, so you feed the fire sage, you feed the fire tobacco, you feed the fire, if it's hungry, a little food, maybe if it's sleepy, a little coffee. We build a relationship with the fire. And then I went to sleep. This was my first mistake. Everybody went back to their tents to go to sleep, so I did too, even though I was the last person tending the ceremonial fire. And I can't say exactly what time it was because I didn't have a watch. I don't ever wear a watch, actually, but I didn't have any timepiece of any kind. But in the middle of the night, before Venus came up, I heard Grandfather Leon's soft, mellifluous voice speaking in my ear. And he just said, "Glenn, get up and tend the fire." But he wasn't there. It was just his voice. But so it was very cold out there. It happens. The ceremonies happen in October. It's their New Year's ceremony. It was very cold. I actually was dressed fully. I had all my clothes on, sleeping under the sleeping bag, and all I had to do was put on my shoes and get up. But then, as soon as I got up, I fell down because I was literally floored by the stars. That's the reason I moved to New Mexico. The stars are so beautiful and so bright, and because the stars are so beautiful and so bright, I never feel a need for a flashlight, so I can see the fire off in the distance. There are coyotes howling in the background and really close by, but I gather myself and I walk to the fire, and sure enough, Mitchell, when I got to the fire, it was almost dying, so I needed to rebuild that fire. And so I did. I rebuilt it in a roaring blaze, and then perhaps I made my second mistake. I went back to sleep again. I had been misinformed. Somebody played a prank on me. They told me that Leon's son, his eldest son, Orlando, who's a beautiful Native American flute player, was going to awaken us by playing flute. That didn't happen. there was the human coyote in the camp. I won't say his name but he's yelling, prepare yourself. Hey, coffee, you're burning daylight, and he wakes us up 2.5 hours about before sunrise. And then I think Venus was still not up, or just about up. All right, so then we go, and the most beautiful thing happens, which is that the medicine men sing songs to awaken. Sing songs to invite the sun to come up, and they do, and O Jonas Lee, O Jonas Lee, O Jonas Lee. They're singing, and for the 2.5 hours, and when that sun comes up, that's when I have a realization, really for the first time, I would say, that sun that's coming up in the sky is the same sun as that central fire, is the same sun as my solar plexus, is the same sun as all the lights in the sky. I understood how consciousness is light. I understood that fire in the belly, literally. And I felt it, and that was beautiful, but that's not the point of the story. Then I saw something remarkable, which is that Grandfather Leon is coming back into camp. And he wasn't, what happened was he got a message. It wasn't a cell phone message or a text message, because we don't have those things out there, but he got a message that people were lost. And then he had the power to know where they were lost and go find them, which is what he did. And what he was doing, even when I got his voice in my ear. He was not there in the camp then. He had gone to get those people. So I started to wonder, how did he do that? How did he know to speak into my ear, How did he bilocate? I assumed he must have bilocated his consciousness, and he had been able to observe the fire dimming and to speak into my ear to awaken me to go feed the fire again, right? So that's what I was kind of my premise, but I wasn't sure. So that day when we were going out to do our ceremonies and say our prayers and make offerings in sacred sites, I saddled up to Leon and I asked him, Leon, how did you speak in my ear last night? But he didn't answer. Like a lot of native elders don't answer when you're asking the wrong question. And he just, but in a way he did answer, Mitchell, because his not answering, was saying to me, Glenn, be present, don't try to figure it out, be here, right. This is beautiful, definitely. You're here to pray, you're not here to be a scientist. At the same time, or actually several days later, I heard from Orlando Secatero. Remember the eldest son who plays flute? Well, he's also trained in the medicine ways, and he said to me, Glenn, that wasn't Leon who spoke into your ear in the middle of the night. That was the fire speaking into your ear, disguising its voice as Leon so you would listen.
Oh, God.
And that's what I mean by the origin of our consciousness is in nature. That was my experience. That was a profound experience for me and alerted me to start looking for the source of my consciousness in that way in the future, and I really have been ever since. And that's really, that's the way, Native America has fed me. But... Oh, God.
It's a way of knowing. It's a broad, truly holistic embrace of the larger multidimensional aspects of reality. And in comparison, it appears, Glenn, that our culture and what's passed on generation to generation is the narrowest band of potential that really exists in the larger universe. And embedded even in Western culture, of course, are the gems of reality. Actually, they're everywhere, but based on, I would put it, a mercantile culture, a customized economic model that has put money and power as the virtually singular values of our society. We have lost track of that wisdom that is otherwise it's actually abundant and embedded at the same time, and shares a lot with Native American wisdom, and even the upsurge and realization, if you will, of quantum physics is an expression of that.
Yeah, let's talk about this a little bit, Mitchell. This is really important, and I don't want to go too quickly to thinking myself that our salvation is going to come only from indigenous peoples. We need to look deep into our own culture and realize that we thought the same way before too. To me, let's look at like Plato and Socrates. They understood that the natures were where wisdom was. They also, like Gurdjieff, understood that what was important was to remember what was already there in nature.
Yeah.
They didn't
already written.
Well, it's not necessarily written, but it's already there and
written in nature. I don't mean as
written in nature. Sure. I also like, I looked in the book at some similarities between Socrates and Descartes because both Socrates and Descartes, had this radical doubt, but I think the difference is, and the writing on the wall was created when Descartes, who had the same radical doubt as Socrates, also was searching for some kind of reliable way to know how you know something. And so was, what Socrates was doing was searching for wisdom and not trying to hold on or accumulate knowledge. The holding on and accumulation of knowledge, in my view, is actually counter to what I would call original thinking. Original thinking is really a direct revelation, a nature revealing herself to us. When we stopped believing in that, that's when we got to the place where, Francis Bacon was bemoaning, let's put nature on the rack and torture her to get her secrets, The only reason why he had to even think like that is because he gave up his trust, his faith that nature would reveal himself. And we started to switch to try to create a method where we control and predict the future. And all this is connected up with what I was talking about before, with linear perspective, because now the future is in front of us and we're trying to predict and control the future. Unlike the way, for the ancient Greeks, it was the past that was in front of them.
Was in front of us.
Because the past had already manifested. I love the way you talked
about that in the book, by the way. I love the way
I did talk about that because I learned it from Moonhawk.
This perspective.
Yeah, the past was in front of us because it had already manifested, so we had eyes to see. But, some of your listeners, I'm sure, have read Carlos Castaneda and remember how he talks about...
I was thinking about him as you've been talking, Yeah,
I know that. So death is stalking us from behind. And, remember that? So that is... The future is behind us in that kind of conception, and actually that kind of appeals to me more. There's other ways of thinking about it too. You could think about what Dave Abram the way he likes to think about it in very spatial sensory awareness is really that the past is buried under the ground, the future is beyond the horizon, or around the corner. It really, there's a lot of ways to think about this, obviously, but, one of my favorites... I want to bring something
to bear, however. At this moment,
sure.
I want to share with you some wisdom that came to me through my studies of Tai Chi Chuan and Taoist thinking. And, of course, it won't surprise you at all, Glenn, being from out east originally, that my greatest Tai Chi teacher was a bald-headed, pot-bellied Jewish guy from Brooklyn, and Lou Kleinsmith.
Oh, okay.
By the way, that wouldn't surprise you, right?
No.
He was actually a student of Professor Cheng Man-ching, who was Chiang Kai-shek's personal physician. So he was of a very rich, deep lineage. And in fact, since you once lived in Woodstock, Lou Kleinsmith used to live in and teach in Socrates, right next door to Woodstock, which was our upstate school, basically.
His name sounds familiar. That's a...
Yeah, he was a legend, and I was so blessed to know him back in the 70s and study with him. And he used to engage us in an exercise, Glenn, which was called seeing and sensing from the back. And because our eyes and our physical structure is such that our eyes are what we call in front, we would always realize that our sense of backness was almost non-existent. There's nothing in our culture that really has us relate to our own back, except if we want it scratched or massaged. And, that wasn't enough. So he had us do, right? He had us do exercises where we would open up the intelligence of our back, and of course, the kidneys are there, bladder 23, the opening of the gateway of non-form to form in the Chinese Taoist cosmology of going from pre-chi to chi in the body, and so there's an entire world.
Sorry. Okay, go ahead. Just kidding.
There's a whole world back there that we are not cognizant of because we're always cognizant of what is up here. So I just wanted to bring that to bear in all that you're sharing with us.
That's very good. I think Jason Kidd, the basketball player, probably took that class too because he was good at, passing to people behind him.
And I ride my bicycle all over New York City. And I can only tell you that over the course of years, and because of my Tai Chi practice, I am super sensitive to all that's going on behind me, every bit as much as I am what's in front. And that's sort of a real-world expression of this kind of wisdom in action, if you will, and, just to share with you. In fact, I'd love to ask you now of how this idea of original thinking that you have been really so beautifully articulating through your writing as well as your teaching and the think tank, etc., how do you see this affecting our culture, influencing and shaping it for the good, just like we know ancient indigenous people of Turtle Island and elsewhere know that they are in dialogue with nature all the time. They know that we can influence weather patterns and have been doing so for thousands of years, that Castaneda brings us the wisdom of shape-shifting, which idea has certainly entered our culture as we become more sensitized to shamanic wisdom. How do you see the work you're doing in the think tank activity as helping to shape even our body politic, our economic model, our social skills and ways of being?
Wow, that's a big question, and I don't know that I know the answer to it, but I'm gonna share with you just my current state of thinking.
Sure.
First of all, the steering committee that I'm working with, they almost don't like the word think tank, so we're really a think tank.
Yeah.
We are and because we begin from, the origin of thinking is thanking. I put that in my book, and I didn't have to highlight it because I said, remember this if you do not remember anything else from the book.
Yes.
The origin of thinking is thanking. It's thinking that begins in wholeness remains in wholeness. So,
and
that really is what we want to emphasize. So we're really, in a way, a think tank. Where a think tank tends to identify a problem in the society and then try to create a solution.
And it's also very mental. It's very head-based.
Yeah.
It connotes the head brain distinct from the heart brain or the gut brain, for that matter. So I very much appreciate your point.
That's right. So, in a sense, the work of the Circle for Original Thinking is we're partly a meta think tank. We're a think tank about thought, about the origin of thought and how it manifests in the world. But our purpose is different than problem solving. Our purpose is in reconnecting us and remembering and restoring our connection to the source of our consciousness, and then seeing how that plays out in the society. Because when we don't realize that, we know that our thinking creates some incoherency in the world, and that's kind of where we're at now. I mean, I do see the Circle for Original Thinking affecting the public discourse, because we really need to get to the root of things. We need to. That's what I try to do in the book. That's what I think we can do through the Circle for Original Thinking vehicle, and it's kind of unlimited. I don't know where it's going to go, really, but the more that we look at the core thoughts that create the situation, then we can begin to see how we can heal this incoherence and inconsistency. I mean, that's my next book is going to be about politics, actually, and I know people may be horrified to hear that, perhaps, because people are very disenchanted.
I don't think so.
You're not horrified, good. But
no,
for me,
not at all.
Okay, good.
To the contrary.
Because actually, our mutual friend James O.D. is delighted that I'm going to move in this direction, because what I want to do is seek to dissolve the apparent dichotomy between different ways of thinking. So, for instance, between liberals and conservatives. So that's one place to start. And there's just so much that can be unveiled there. But really, let's take the Republican and Democratic parties, for instance. They're dance partners in ways that they don't ever realize. So, 150 years ago, the Republican Party of today was more like the Democratic Party of 150 years ago, and the Democratic Party was what's that? Yeah,
it was
the Republicans
Liberal Party.
Yes, they were the party that was against slavery. Obviously, Abraham Lincoln was a Republican,
That's right.
and the Republican Party continued to be the party that was more for civil rights right up until the 1960s. There were more Republican votes for civil rights legislation in the 1960s than there were Democratic votes. A lot of people don't realize that, and it's only then that the Southern Democrats fled the party and became the base of today's Republican Party. So, this kind of thing happens. Yeah, this kind of thing happens all the time because that's very interesting. I noticed I almost slipped into a New York accent. I'm talking to you, but I don't normally have that. But anyway, what's happening is that seeming opposites, seeming polarities are really dance partners. So we have to learn how to dance with that. We have to learn how to not make an opposite opinion into an other or just wrong. We need to see how that is actually unfolding in life. That's the beginning premise of and it's part of the work of the Circle for Original Thinking also.
I'm all for it. In fact, there have been people who have taken up this same subject and have created fora where Democrats and Republicans, I'm trying to remember who it was, one or two that I have come across in the last year, that are establishing different kinds of environments, contexts for Republicans and Democrats to come to the middle ground and see what it is they agree on. I mean, certainly they all agree on taking money from the same sources. Ho, ho, ho. And, that's no problem. But ideologically,
well,
ideologically, there are differences. And I come from the school, since you've brought this up, of non-ideological thinking, which means what works? What works? How could everyone be served? I know that's not that sexy, but I like it.
Well, it's very important. I believe, what I would like to see in the world is conservatives who conserve things that are worth conserving, like the air, the water, the earth.
The elements. You bet. I've said that all along. I used to say that to my father, Glenn, when I first started coming of age as a young teenager, looking at the pollution in Bridgeport, Connecticut, as we drove by, and I was utterly horrified by the black soot coming out of the smokestacks. And I'm not going to tell the whole story, but that is basically, I said, Dad, if the conservatives are for this, what is it they want to conserve? I said, I'm a true conservative. All environmentalists are actually conservatives because we want to conserve nature. Please,
that should be
Dad.
that should be the but for some reason it's got all flipped and very complex, and we're not going to unravel it here. But there is something here. It's very similar to dialogue that brings together groups that seemingly have polarized views. If you just listen for the purpose of understanding rather than to ready your reply, that's why I'm for dialogue. The concept of debate is a very silly concept, and in today's debate doesn't really actually help generally.
Solve anything.
And it doesn't tend to solve things, and it's tremendously fraught with, appearances. I mean, which makes for great satire. I mean, I love Saturday Night Live coming on, and the character who's playing Hillary Clinton starts by saying, "I think you're going to love the character of Hillary that we prepared for you tonight."
Right. No, it's so you're right. It's right. I find that humor, at the end of the day, even though I'm deeply involved in the healing arts, professionally, I find, Glenn, that after all, and this is cross-cultural, and that humor is the thing that unites. It's the power of humor that brings people together. When they smile together and laugh together, a morphogenetic field gets created that nothing can touch. I've developed an entire scenario for people such as Obama and Putin to come together, listen to original Russian folk songs, drink a little vodka, and actually sit down, laugh together, and get down to real business.
Huh?
Anyway,
well, I think it's great. I mean, you're onto something. It's very important. Yes, I mean, and people do realize that sometimes, and sometimes they act on it. And
that's right.
And certainly, we can encourage it.
Exactly, we really can. Well, I feel your book helps to really advance the conversation of our seeing from a larger and higher point of view and a deeper, more rooted point of view. I want to just quote something that has been swimming in my head since we began, when you said the wonderful phrase that our thoughts come from nature. And then I kind of followed by saying, yes, they're elemental. I was thinking about a very, I felt, poignant comment that my dear friend Terence McKenna said back in the mid-'90s, early 90s actually, when I was with him in a workshop in downtown Soho, when he was asked in the class, Terence, what is God? And he said, biology. And he could have easily have said nature. It was just his way of putting it. But I felt he was absolutely right on the track.
Well, he's saying, the study of life, is God.
Correct.
And yeah, I mean, I probably would go more toward the elements, light, air, water, earth, but it's the same thing, really.
It is. Theos. Life
One thing I wanted to bring up that's moving through me these days in partnership with Rob Williams and the Psyche people.
We were discussing that.
Yeah, they work with shifting habitual patterns of thought and behavior that limit a person's ability. Because when I first met Rob, he said, Glenn, if you're saying that your thoughts come from nature, then it seems like nature is kind of suicidal because we're doing all these things that are kind of, corrupting nature. We're polluting the water, we're polluting the air, and he had a really important point. So I think and it became the basis of an agreement of, partnership because, his work is about aligning people with to receive directly and get their filters and interference patterns not exactly out of the way, but to become congruent, to become constructive patterns, and so you can receive the message directly, and that makes all the sense in the world because you know how far our world has come in the last. This wasn't like this. I'm sure that a long time ago, we all were pretty directly connected with nature, with our thoughts. That's why the origin of thinking is thanking in many languages, because originally all our thoughts were prayers. They connected us with nature. But somewhere along the line, we did go astray, so much so that when somebody now can receive directly from nature, we call it a revelation, and we're ready to start a religion over it.
That's good.
but we all ought to be doing that. I mean, that's our birthright is to allow nature to reveal herself to us.
That's right. So, I love it. That's beautiful. I want to. We're almost out of. It sounds so weird talking
linear time units.
Phrase. We're almost out of time. Well, where did it go? That actually brings up. There it goes now. Another really salient point you make in the book is the dimension of time as us, we being time. I got to tell you, with all my inner work and outer study, etc., over the course of years, I felt that was such an interesting thing that I had not encountered quite articulated the way you did. I really, really was engaged by that.
The credit goes to grandfather Leon Secatero, because he's the one who said, and it just moved through me. He said that time is the fifth element. Yes. Now he didn't explain it to me, so I did come to my own interpretation. So if the elements are light, air, water, earth, because Leon said light instead of fire generally, light, air, water, earth, and time is the fifth element. It seems to me that time is the animating principle of the cosmos. Time is what moves things. Time is what, like the ancients called fohat, and time is this very special animating force. And if it's like that, it's within us. It's within our belly, really, and it unfolds just like a spider unfolds her web. And isn't that beautiful? I mean, once you think like that, then you don't really, that's really the original way we thought about time. And it's only, after linear perspective was invented and clocks were invented and stuff, that we began to think of time as an abstraction apart from us.
Yeah.
I mean, but Newton couldn't do that.
In the book.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And it's so interesting that these earlier scientists at the time of the Renaissance were also, and you note, of course, in your book, they were very religious men. So they were open to spirit on
yes,
some
they were.
very important levels, and there was no disparity or polarity between being a religious man and being a scientist. I think
That's right.
it was only later that the Roman Catholic Church decided to drive a wedge between them for various economic and political reasons. That's a whole other conversation.
Yeah.
But
that's an in-depth conversation, but you're right. They were
Indeed.
united because, science, remember,
exactly.
only means to know.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I'd like to conclude with revisiting a comment you made that we kind of moved right along from, but it was incredible for me about your experience in the story of tending the fire and the revelation that you had in doing so, that we skipped along in order to get to the next part of the story. But would you please share with us internally that epiphany, that connectedness that you experienced?
You're talking about when the sun rose up over the hill in the morning. Yeah.
That's right. When you said the solar plexus and that sun and that fire, I realized we're all essentially part of my consciousness, and we can remove the word "my," but we can put it in kind of in quotes. Well, it's not yours, it's mine. No, it's ours. No, if you would comment on that.
I can comment on that and maybe even augment it a little bit, because one of the things that I learned from Nancy Maryboy, a Navajo who was part of our dialogue circle, she spoke of the word Tsutsuyo, which was the Navajo word for the original light of our consciousness. And this is really getting to what I came to understand as original thinking. So for a Western astronomer, we look up in the sky and we tend to say that light is coming from an ancient time, that it happened a long time ago. We sometimes paint it as an illusion. It's not really now. Well, yes. I think it's both. So it's not that it's untrue what the astronomer's saying, but at the same time, it also is happening for us now in our bodies.
Yes.
So it's why I think the stars are associated with the ancestors, because they are our ancestors. And so that ancestral light from whence we came is what is infusing us now, and it's infusing it. That light is the same. That's what creates our consciousness, and it is the same light of the sun coming up in our planet, and the same light of the fires that we create, and the same light in our solar plexus. And that's really a very beautiful thing to feel in your belly.
Absolutely. No, that's a beautiful imaging and picturing of it. And it also, since you mentioned Rob Williams, and I originally learned about Rob through my dear friend, cellular biologist Bruce Lipton.
Right.
I'm thinking of my first interview with him, which was back in the early 90s, when it seems hard to believe, but very few people knew about Bruce Lipton, relatively speaking, whereas now he's an international phenomenon. I love him, and his work is incredible. In fact, he'll be on in another week or two back with me. We've had him on a number of times. His work in fractals, in fractal relationships. That was the name of my first interview with him. Fractal biology. And so what, from a somewhat different but completely parallel point of view, your experience of yourself as, the fire, the light, the sunrise, all of it in this very magnificent connectedness is of, our in fractal relationship to each other. Micro, macro.
Yeah.
Yeah. would you say?
Well, fractals are important. It's another window, by the way, into understanding that time is not linear, because time unfolds the way fractals unfold, the way that all of nature unfolds as a spiral. And we see those beautiful fractal spirals in nature everywhere, it's because that's the Nautilus. The Nautilus, the pine cone, the seashell. There's so many seed head. There's so many different ways in when nature is unfolding this pattern, and that's something we have to pay attention to. It's really the original beauty. It's here all over the place.
There you go. It's so true. Well, Glenn, I've got to just say it's been a complete pleasure to speak with you and listen to you and hear your stories and your world and cosmo view, if you will. I really appreciate it, and just keep up the good work.
Well, thank you. I appreciate the work that you are doing in the world. Thank you so much, Mitchell, and keep it up.
Absolutely. I will do so. Give your website so people can visit.
That would be www.originalthinking.us. You could say U.S., but it doesn't have to do with politics. Just think you and me.
Right.
.us.
I like
Originalthinking.us.
Beautiful.
Thank you.
Beautiful.
Blessings.
Absolutely. Thank you again, Glenn.
You're welcome.
We'll talk
Take
another
care.
time.
All right.
Bye-bye. Glenn Aparicio, what a wonderful name, Parry, the author of Original Thinking, a radical revisioning of time, humanity, and nature. He just took us on such a wonderful journey through thinking and looking at it from a deeper point of view. I got to say, when I first heard from him, he wrote down the name of his book, Original Thinking, and that he was very interested in that idea. And I got completely trapped by the Western perspective, despite everything. I thought, original thinking, I don't find that so interesting, an idea of an original thought. That is from the regular Western worldview that he talked about at the beginning of this interview, distinct from the indigenous understanding of going back to the meaning of the word origin. And that gives a much deeper view. And I felt myself afterwards feeling a little embarrassed, and I had been a little glib and said, well, original thinking, I don't think there's an original thought in the world. That perspective. And in his gentleness, he kind of showed me that he was really referring to something else, altogether something else. And that's just part of his way of teaching, and I very much appreciated it. In any event, I want to just thank you all for coming and joining today at A Better World Radio. I want to remind you that you can go to our website, abetterworld.tv or abetterworld.net, and you can sign up for our free weekly newsletter that announces the guests that we will be having on. Usually we have guests, sometimes not, and we'll let you know either way. We also have a weekly television show here in Manhattan, in the Big Apple, every Monday evening at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, of course, and you can watch it on television in Manhattan, community cable television, or online at that very same website, abetterworld.tv, from wherever you may be on the planet, for that matter. And just tune in, and at the top it says, to watch, click here. And voila, you are in and on and participating. And we have these kinds of shows that are educational, uplifting, oftentimes inspiring, we've been told many, many times over the years, and maybe even transformational. So tune in, become part of the solution of our planet's issues, conflicts, and themes, fulfilling our own archetypal imprint so we can walk the path of contributing to the larger good, the common good. So appreciate your attention, and please also remember that we are a 501c3, a Better World Foundation, and any contribution, I really like to call it investment in a better world, gets used so wisely and prudently by us to keep us on the air and expanding our media platform. So please do remember us in your thoughts, of course, and your actions. So with that said, I want to just thank you all again, and I look forward to seeing you all